He vanished without a trace in 1996, leaving behind only a family shattered by silence. Decades later, a torn photo hidden in an old album uncovered secrets no one was ready to face. What was revealed would change everything they thought they knew about his disappearance. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. I remember that day. In 1996, like it was burned into my skin, every detail sharper than a winter frost, colder than the truth I'd come to live with. It was early October, the kind of day when the sun still holds some warmth, but the air carries a crisp warning that winter was sneaking up on us. My brother, Daniel, was 12 then, full of restless energy, a mix of charm and mischief that made him impossible not to notice. I'd woken to the sound of his laughter, echoing through the hallway, a soundtrack to a morning full of scraped knees and promises to meet after school for whatever trouble 12-year-olds find on a late autumn day. We shared breakfast, bickering over who got the last piece of toast, and I remember how his eyes sparkled with a secret grin like he already knew something I didn't. That day, he was wearing his favorite faded blue jacket, the one with the threadbare elbows, and he kept fussing with the laces on his old sneakers like he was readying himself for a race he never told me about. I saw him off as he left for school, his backpack slung low, his step light but purposeful, and I thought nothing of it when he waved and disappeared around the corner. But that was the last time I saw him. Hours later, the phone call came, the one that shattered the day's fragile calm. He'd vanished from school grounds without a trace, last seen near the old oak tree by the playground. But no one knew where he went after that. The school said he'd left detention early. The janitor swore he saw a shadow slipping out the back door, but no footprints led away, no cries or whispers were heard, and no one found a sign he ever really left. My parents were frantic, the house swallowed whole by panic and desperate prayers, searching rooms and streets until their voices cracked, until the sun slipped away and left us alone with a growing silence. I remember sitting on the porch, clutching his baseball cap like a lifeline, the fabric worn soft and smelling faintly of grass and rain, wishing it would whisper back to me. Days turned into weeks, and the town started to murmur theories, accusations, rumors about who might have taken him or where he could have run off to. But I never believed he'd just disappear. Not Daniel. Not my brother. The space he left wasn't empty. It was full of unanswered questions and a terrible weight that settled deep in my chest, one that stayed with me even as the seasons changed and life went on. Every year since, that day plays on repeat in my mind, his last laugh, his hurried goodbye, the way the sunlight caught the dust motes in his hair, like it was trying to hold on to something precious before it slipped away. It was the day everything changed. The day my brother vanished and left behind a family desperate for truth and a sister who refused to let the story end in silence. I found the family photo album one rainy afternoon when I was rummaging through the attic, chasing ghosts of a past I thought I understood but clearly did not. The album was old, its leather cover cracked and soft from years of being handled, tucked behind boxes of forgotten toys and stacks of dusty books. Pulling it out, I felt a strange mix of comfort and unease, like opening a window to a room full of half-whispered secrets. The pages were yellowed and smelled faintly of mildew and childhood, each photo a frozen moment of laughter, celebrations, and everyday life we tried so hard to hold on to after Daniel disappeared. There were pictures of birthdays, family vacations, and holidays, faces smiling in sunlight and shadows. But my eyes kept drifting to one particular page, the one with the torn photograph. It was a picture I had never seen before, half ripped along the edge as if someone had tried to erase the memory it held. It showed Daniel standing next to my parents, but his face was cut away, leaving only the outline of his body and the blurred edges of the smiles around him. That missing piece haunted me more than any full image. It felt like a deliberate erasure, a part of our story pulled out and hidden in plain sight. I flipped through the rest of the album, but that torn photo anchored itself in my mind, like a puzzle missing its final piece. How had it gone unnoticed for all these years? Whose hand had torn it? And why? The rest of the album was filled with faces that looked back at me with familiarity, but this one held a weight I couldn't ignore, a silent accusation, a question, a cry from the past that refused to be silenced. I began to wonder if the album was less a collection of memories and more a map of the secrets our family had buried with Daniel's disappearance. I took the album downstairs and spread it across the kitchen table, the pages cracking softly under my fingertips, and I studied every photo like a detective hunting for clues. Each image told a story, but the torn one was a reminder that some stories had been edited, some truths hidden behind smiles and posed faces. I found myself returning to that photo again and again, trying to imagine the face that had been ripped away, the moment captured just before or after the tear. It was as if Daniel was there, and not there at the same time, a ghost lingering between the paper fibers. That album, that torn photograph, became a silent witness to the life that once was, and the mystery that still needed solving. I realized then that if I was going to find answers, I had to confront the pain and the silence the album kept locked inside. It was time to uncover what had been hidden all these years, to follow the story that began with a missing boy and led me here to this torn fragment of memory. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, the torn photograph laid carefully before me like a fragile relic that demanded respect and silence. The ragged edge, where the paper had been ripped, was rough beneath my fingertips, and I found myself tracing the jagged line over and over, as if the shape of the tear itself might tell me more than the missing piece ever could. I turned the photo this way and that, trying to piece together what had been lost and why, but it wasn't the obvious absence that caught my attention. It was what lingered just behind the rip, a ghost of an image half hidden, like a secret whispered in shadow. At first, it looked like nothing but a blur of colors and shapes, faint outlines, a patch of sky, maybe the edge of a building or a tree branch, but as I focused, the shapes sharpened in my mind, and something unmistakable emerged. There was a partial face there. Not Daniel's, not anyone I recognized from the family, but someone else entirely, their expression half seen, guarded, and somehow urgent. It was as if someone had tucked a hidden message behind that torn edge, a secret the photograph had tried to keep but that now refused to stay buried. I flipped the photo over and held it up to the light, catching shadows that danced beneath the paper's surface, and my heart thudded when I realized the image didn't belong to any place I had ever known. No familiar backyard or family room. The colors and textures were foreign, a strange and eerie contrast to the warm, faded memories in the rest of the album. Questions flooded my mind in waves. Who was this stranger lurking in the margins of our history? Why was their face hidden behind the tear? Had someone wanted to erase this person from our lives? Or had they been protecting us from something worse? I felt the weight of the photograph's silence pressing on me, like it was holding a truth too dangerous to say aloud. My fingers trembled as I reached for the magnifying glass I kept in the drawer for small tasks, holding it above the photo's surface, searching for clues invisible to the naked eye. The grain of the paper, the smudges of ink, Even the slight curl of the corner seemed to hum with secrets waiting to be uncovered. I was no stranger to loss or mystery, but this felt different. It felt like a door had creaked open in a place I thought was sealed forever, and whatever waited on the other side was watching me, waiting for me to decide what to do next. I pressed my forehead to the cool wood of the table and whispered Daniel's name, a prayer for guidance, or maybe just a plea for courage. The torn photograph wasn't just a missing piece of paper. It was a silent witness, a puzzle piece from a past I had only just begun to understand. And deep down, I knew that whatever truth it hid would change everything. As I turned the fragile pages of the family album, the faded photographs whispered old stories. But it was the shadows in the background that began to speak loudest to me, drawing my eyes to faces I did not recognize, to shapes that should not have been there. The sun-dappled picnics, birthday parties, and holiday gatherings were all carefully captured moments, but somewhere behind the smiling and laughter, behind the innocence frozen in time, lurked a presence I had never noticed before. At first, it was just a glimpse, a blurred figure half hidden behind a tree in a summer photo, or a vague silhouette lingering near the edge of a Christmas snapshot. But as I flipped through more pages, the same shadowy figure kept appearing, always nearby Daniel, as if silently watching or waiting. The unsettling thought wormed its way into my mind. This was no coincidence. That face was following him through the years, silently threading itself through our memories without anyone ever naming it aloud. I studied the photos obsessively, trying to focus on details others might have missed. The tilt of a head, the angle of a glance, the way light fell unevenly over that figure's features. The person was always obscured, just enough to avoid full recognition, but the unease in their eyes, barely visible, set my skin on edge. It felt like a quiet warning, a secret buried within family memories, a ghost haunting the edges of the past. I tried to remember if anyone in the family had ever mentioned this person, but the silence was deafening. No one had acknowledged the figure or its meaning. It was as if the family had unconsciously chosen to turn away, to pretend that what lurked in the margins did not exist. I felt the weight of that silence press down on me as heavily as the memories themselves. That face was a puzzle piece, a clue, but also a challenge. Who were they? Why were they always near Daniel? And more terrifyingly, what had they done? The more I looked, the more I realized the album was not just a collection of joyful moments, but a carefully curated story where some pieces had been deliberately hidden or removed. Each unfamiliar face was a thread leading deeper into a tangled web of secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to unravel, but couldn't resist. As I closed the album, my hands trembling, I whispered a silent plea to Daniel and to whatever truth the shadows held that this time I would not look away. I would find the answers those forgotten faces were trying to tell me, no matter how dark or painful the truth might be. When I first brought up the torn photo at the family gathering, the room shifted like a tide suddenly pulled back from the shore, exposing the cold, jagged rocks no one wanted to face. Faces that once felt familiar tightened into masks of unease, and conversations stuttered, trailing off into awkward silences, as if the very mention of that fragment of the past stirred up ghosts best left sleeping. My uncle cleared his throat loudly, fumbling with his glass as his eyes darted away from mine, while my aunt's smile slipped, replaced by a nervous glance toward the window, as if the answer might be found in the grey sky outside. No one wanted to speak directly about the torn photograph, and the air grew thick with words unspoken, promises of forgetting, and warnings couched in half-meant phrases. "Some things," my grandmother said quietly, her voice cracked like old paint, "are better left in the past where they belong." But even as she said it, I saw the tremble in her hands and the faraway look in her eyes that told me she was wrestling with memories she wished she could unsee. It became clear that the torn photo was more than just an image. It was a symbol of silence. A door that once opened could unleash a flood of family secrets, shame, and regret. I felt the weight of all those silent warnings settle on my shoulders, like the invisible chains that had kept the past locked away for decades. But I couldn't stop. I needed to know why the photograph had been torn, why some faces were hidden or erased, and what truths lay beneath the carefully crafted smiles and staged poses. Over the next few days, I caught snippets of hushed conversations, worried glances exchanged behind closed doors, and an undercurrent of fear that the family's fragile peace might shatter if the past was fully exposed. Some relatives avoided me altogether, as if my questions were a contagion, threatening to spread discord. But others, in private moments, slipped me fragments of memories, cryptic and broken half-truths about old disputes, a night that was never spoken of, a man who shouldn't have been there. The more I learned, the clearer it became that the torn photo was a thread pulling at a tapestry woven from deception and pain. Every family has its skeletons, but ours seemed to live just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to pull back the veil. I felt the loneliness of that burden keenly, knowing I might be the only one willing to walk into the darkness, to seek the answers hidden in the shadows of those whispered secrets. And so, despite the warnings and the fear, I pressed on, because some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deeply we try to hide them. While rifling through the attic boxes, I found an old leather-bound diary tucked beneath a pile of forgotten books and yellowed newspapers. The cover was worn, the edges frayed like the memories it held inside, and when I opened it, the scent of must and time wrapped around me like a shroud. The handwriting was unmistakably my brother's, slanted and hurried, a stark contrast to the careful penmanship of our parents' letters. Each page was a window into a world I'd never known, a secret life he'd hidden from everyone, even us. The entries started innocently enough, recounting mundane school days and childhood adventures. But as I flipped further, the tone shifted, darkened like the fading light at dusk. There were passages filled with fear, a palpable, raw terror that pulsed beneath the lines, making my skin crawl as I read about shadows lurking at the edges of his vision and the gnawing sense that he was being watched by someone. Something unnamed, but relentless. He wrote about footsteps echoing in empty hallways, whispers that didn't belong to any friend or family member, and the eerie feeling that every window and door was a potential trap. More than once, he mentioned plans to run, to disappear, before the danger found him a desperate hope, scribbled in the margins, crossed out, and rewritten like a secret prayer. The diary felt like a cry for help frozen in time, pages soaked in the desperation of a boy who had no one to trust but the empty lines of his journal. I found myself reading late into the night, the flickering candlelight casting trembling shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of his words. Each entry deepened the mystery, pulling me further into a labyrinth of fear and silence that had been kept locked away for decades. There were references to a figure he called the Watcher, never described but always present, a silent menace just beyond reach. He wrote about moments when he caught glimpses of this person standing too close, their gaze heavy and unblinking, and how those moments left him trembling with a cold that no fire could chase away. The diary ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if he had been interrupted or forced to stop writing. The final words were haunting. "I don't know how much longer I can stay quiet. They're coming. I have to leave before it's too late." Holding that book, I felt the weight of his fear settle over me like a storm cloud ready to break. It was a puzzle piece I hadn't known was missing, a glimpse into a hidden terror that explained more than any question I had ever asked. I knew then that uncovering the truth about his disappearance meant facing those fears head-on, walking the same shadowed path he had tried to escape, and finally giving voice to the silence that had haunted our family for so long. I never thought I'd find anyone who remembered that night, but after days of searching, I tracked down Tommy, one of my brother's childhood friends who still lived in town. When I found him, his face was weathered by time, but his eyes held the same sharpness I remembered from their childhood escapades. At first, he was hesitant, glancing over his shoulder like the past might still be watching us. Slowly, he began to open up about things no one had ever spoken aloud in my family's presence. He told me about a visitor, a man no one in the neighborhood recognized, who came by the house the night my brother vanished. Tommy's voice dropped as he described the figure's quiet but unsettling presence, how he lingered near the porch long after everyone else had gone inside. The man didn't talk much, but his eyes were piercing, and there was a coldness to him that made even the bravest kids uneasy. Tommy remembered that my brother had been nervous that evening, more jumpy than usual, and had stayed close to the porch light, as if trying to keep something at bay. He recalled overhearing fragments of a conversation between the visitor and one of the adults, a few words that didn't make sense then but now hit me like a hammer. Not a word. Everything depends on silence. Tommy confessed he never told anyone because he was afraid, because the family seemed to want to bury the memory, pretending it had never happened. Listening to him, I felt a mixture of relief and dread, like I had found a missing piece to a puzzle that had haunted us for decades, but the edges were jagged and sharp. This man, whoever he was, had been there close enough to touch my brother's life moments before he disappeared, and the silence surrounding him was louder than any confession. Tommy's story was the first real thread of truth I had grasped, but it also raised more questions. Who was this visitor? What had been said in those hushed tones behind closed doors? And most importantly, what had he done to my brother? I left Tommy's house with a heavy heart and a head full of racing thoughts, knowing that this new clue meant I was deeper in the shadows of a secret that others still fought to keep hidden. But for the first time, I felt that maybe the silence was breaking, that the past was waking, and with it, the possibility that I could finally uncover what happened to the brother I lost so long ago. I never thought I'd find anyone who remembered that night, but after days of searching, I tracked down Tommy, one of my brother's childhood friends who still lived in town. When I found him, his face was weathered by time, but his eyes held the same sharpness I remembered from their childhood escapades. At first, he was hesitant, glancing over his shoulder like the past might still be watching us. Slowly, he began to open up about things no one had ever spoken aloud in my family's presence. He told me about a visitor, a man no one in the neighborhood recognized, who came by the house the night my brother vanished. Tommy's voice dropped as he described the figure's quiet but unsettling presence, how he lingered near the porch long after everyone else had gone inside. The man didn't talk much, but his eyes were piercing, and there was a coldness to him that made even the bravest kids uneasy. Tommy remembered that my brother had been nervous that evening, more jumpy than usual, and had stayed close to the porch light, as if trying to keep something at bay. He recalled overhearing fragments of a conversation between the visitor and one of the adults, a few words that didn't make sense then but now hit me like a hammer. Not a word. Everything depends on silence. Tommy confessed he never told anyone because he was afraid, because the family seemed to want to bury the memory, pretending it had never happened. Listening to him, I felt a mixture of relief and dread, like I had found a missing piece to a puzzle that had haunted us for decades, but the edges were jagged and sharp. This man, whoever he was, had been there close enough to touch my brother's life moments before he disappeared, and the silence surrounding him was louder than any confession. Tommy's story was the first real thread of truth I had grasped, but it also raised more questions. Who was this visitor? What had been said in those hushed tones behind closed doors? And most importantly, what had he done to my brother? I left Tommy's house with a heavy heart and a head full of racing thoughts, knowing that this new clue meant I was deeper in the shadows of a secret that others still fought to keep hidden. But for the first time, I felt that maybe the silence was breaking, that the past was waking, and with it, the possibility that I could finally uncover what happened to the brother I lost so long ago. While rummaging through the dusty attic, I remembered the old desk in my parents' room, a piece they always kept locked and covered with a faded cloth, as if it held some sacred secret. One afternoon, fueled by a mix of desperation and stubborn resolve, I found the key taped underneath, brittle with age, but still functional. My hands trembled as I slid open the drawer, revealing stacks of old photos, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a bundle of documents tied with a frayed ribbon. The images showed my brother, in moments I had never seen before, some candid and warm, others hauntingly posed, as if someone had been orchestrating memories I was never meant to find. Among the papers were handwritten notes from an investigator, detailing sightings, phone records, and possible leads that never made it into the public eye. There were sketches of a man, vaguely matching the shadowy figure that had appeared in the background of the family album, and references to a secretive group that might have been involved in orchestrating my brother's disappearance. I read about witnesses who had been threatened into silence and reports dismissed without explanation. It was a hidden chapter of our family's story. A veil pulled back on the cracks that had long festered beneath the surface of our quiet life. As I sifted through the contents, a cold realization settled over me. This wasn't just an unsolved case anymore. Someone had deliberately kept the truth from us, burying clues and lives beneath layers of secrecy and fear. The drawer's contents were both a promise and a threat, a glimpse into a darker world that had shadowed my brother's fate and now challenged me to confront it. The weight of those hidden pages pressed down on me, heavier than any photo or whispered rumor, anchoring me to the past, but also pushing me forward into the unknown. I closed the drawer slowly, the lock clicking softly in the quiet room, and felt the first flicker of something I hadn't dared to hope for. A chance to finally rewrite the ending to the story that had haunted my family for nearly 3 decades. As I carefully unfolded the brittle pages of the folder I'd found in the locked drawer, my eyes caught on a series of photographs that made my heart skip. The images were black and white, grainy and blurred, taken from what must have been a hidden camera positioned somewhere near our family home. The photos showed the same quiet street we'd walked 1,000 times, the mailbox still leaning crooked, the old oak tree casting long shadows in the late afternoon Sunday. But there, just beyond the edge of the frame, a figure stood silent, still, and unmistakably out of place. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat and hat, pulled low, his face obscured, but his presence unmistakably menacing. I studied each photo carefully, noting how the man seemed to lurk in the shadows, sometimes near the fence, other times closer to the house itself. One photo showed him standing by the driveway just moments before my brother was last seen, his posture rigid as if waiting for something or someone. The dates scribbled on the back revealed these had been taken just weeks before my brother vanished, but no one in the family ever spoke of such surveillance. Why had this been hidden? Who had set up the camera? And why? A shiver ran down my spine as I realized this wasn't just a stranger wandering through the neighborhood. It was someone watching us, watching him. I thought of the torn photo in the album, the shadowy figure in the background, and this grainy evidence finally made the connection clear. My brother hadn't simply disappeared into thin air. He had been watched, followed, maybe even trapped. The documents accompanying the photos suggested a half-hearted investigation, with police reports noting a person of interest, but no further action taken. Witness statements were vague or intimidated, and the trail had gone cold too fast. I pressed my fingers against the photo, wishing I could reach into the past and change what had been missed, what had been ignored. The silence in the room grew heavy, the weight of years of secrets pressing down on me like a stone. For the first time, I felt the sting of betrayal not just from whoever had taken these photos, but from everyone who had let us believe the disappearance was a mystery without cause. This unseen surveillance was a message, a warning, or worse, a record of the moments before the nightmare began. As I closed the folder gently, I vowed that I would not let this man's shadow fade back into the darkness. Whoever he was, he held the key to what happened that day, and I was going to find out the truth no matter how deep it was buried or who wanted it to stay hidden. It was one of those moments you don't see coming, even when you're clawing through years of silence and shadowed truths, that finally shatters everything you thought was solid. The confession came late, one rainy evening, when the sky outside was a slate gray and the house felt heavy with memories too long held back. The family friend, someone I'd trusted all my life, sat across from me in the dim light, his hands trembling like he was carrying more than just the weight of his words. He spoke slowly, his voice cracking under the pressure of years spent hiding, confessing a truth so tangled and raw, it felt like it cut through the air between us. He said he had known more about Daniel's disappearance than anyone ever let on, that there were secrets whispered behind closed doors, deals made in quiet desperation, and a shadow that stretched far beyond what our family dared to face. The revelation wasn't just about what happened that night in 1996. It was about who was involved, who stood silent, and who chose to bury the past beneath layers of lies. I could feel the room closing in as he unfolded stories of threats, fear, and a chain of events that had left my brother lost, but never forgotten. My heart hammered, a mix of betrayal and relief washing over me, because suddenly the void left by his absence seemed less empty and more like a puzzle with pieces hidden in plain sight. The confession forced me to confront everything. The photo album's torn edges, the faces in the shadows, the locked drawer with its dusty contents, it all connected now. Threads woven into a tapestry of pain and secrecy. I had always wanted answers, but the weight of this truth was heavier than I expected. The friend's eyes, full of sorrow and regret, met mine, and I realized this wasn't just about finding Daniel. It was about uncovering the price of silence. The cost of protecting a family's reputation at the expense of a child's life. For the first time, I understood the complexity of the forces that had conspired to keep the past buried, and why so many had turned away when the truth began to surface. As he finished speaking, the room held its breath with me, the air thick with unspoken questions and fragile hope. I knew then that my journey was far from over. If anything, this confession was a spark, igniting a fire I couldn't put out, a call to finally break the silence and bring light to the darkest corners of my brother's disappearance. And as I left that night, the rain washing over me like a baptism, I felt a strange kind of strength, the beginning of a reckoning long overdue, and the promise that no more secrets would stay hidden in the shadows. The trial was unlike anything I had imagined, not the dramatic courtroom battles or public reckonings I had hoped for, but a quiet, almost invisible war fought behind closed doors, where the stakes were my brother's name and our family's peace. I wasn't allowed to be there. Not really. The proceedings were cloaked in secrecy, sealed documents, and legal jargon that felt like a fortress built to keep the truth locked away. What I learned through whispers, second-hand stories, and a few rare leaked documents was that powerful people had stepped in, weaving a settlement so thorough it bound us in silence, wrapped around us like chains disguised as protection. The terms were clear: no further investigation, no public discussion, no reopening of the wounds that had never fully healed. The family was compelled to agree, to bury our grief in quiet compliance, and in exchange, the case was officially closed, marked resolved, in a way that felt hollow, like slamming a book shut before the last page was read. I remember the cold weight of that reality settling in when I realized the fight for answers had been quietly stolen from us. Not by accident, but by design. The lawyers moved like shadows, their voices soft but their impact crushing, convincing my parents to sign away not just their pursuit of truth, but their very right to remember openly, to demand justice. It felt like being handed a photograph with half the faces torn away, the story incomplete and fading fast. We were left with the silence of the court, a silence that seemed to mock the screams we held inside, the questions that never got asked, and the memories that refused to fade. That silence stretched beyond the courtroom, creeping into family gatherings, conversations with old friends, and the quiet moments when I stood alone with the photo album that still held more secrets than smiles. I watched as my parents retreated behind polite smiles and avoided the subject that had once been the center of our lives, as if the trial had erased not just the legal case, but the emotional heartbeat of our family. I felt anger, betrayal, and an aching loneliness that no apology could soothe. But amid the quiet, a stubborn spark of defiance flickered within me, fueled by the knowledge that silence was the last thing Daniel deserved. The secret trial had tried to rewrite the story, but it couldn't erase the truth written in the torn photograph, the diary entries, and the locked drawer filled with evidence. I vowed then that the silence would not be the end of our story, not while I still had breath to fight for him, to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of secrecy and lies. And so, even as the world around us moved on, I stayed rooted in the past, waiting for the day when the silence would break, and Daniel's name would be spoken again, not in whispers, but in the clear light of justice, finally served. The moment I realized I could no longer wait for answers to come to me, I knew it was time to stop piecing together fragments from the shadows and start facing the truth head-on, even if it meant walking into the storm myself. Every clue I had uncovered, from the torn photograph to the whispered secrets, the locked drawer filled with unseen documents, and the confession that shattered my world, became threads I could pull to unravel the tangled web that had kept my brother Daniel hidden for all these years. I spent nights mapping out the puzzle, connecting names and places, writing lists and marking locations in a worn notebook that felt heavier with each new revelation. I reached out to Warren for help, knowing his calm, steady presence would be crucial for what lay ahead. Our plan wasn't just about finding Daniel. It was about confronting those who had kept the truth buried, those who had silenced us all. I rehearsed conversations in my mind, the questions I would ask, the confrontations I might face, and the possibility that reconciliation might come. But so might danger. The thought of standing face to face with people who had altered the course of our lives was terrifying, but so was the thought of giving up now. I wasn't just chasing memories anymore. I was chasing justice and the hope of healing, both for my brother and for the family we had become after the disappearance. The night before our first meeting, sleep eluded me as I stared at the photo album that had started it all, the torn page a reminder of how much was left unsaid and unseen. I knew this journey might not bring back the years we lost, but it could bring clarity, and maybe, finally, peace. When the day came, Warren and I drove to the address given by the anonymous caller, an old, weathered house on the outskirts of town that seemed frozen in time, much like our story. My hands trembled as I stepped onto the porch, the past pressing down with every creak of the wooden boards beneath my feet. Inside, the air was thick with dust and unspoken histories, and as I saw Daniel sitting quietly in the corner holding the very photo album that had become my lifeline, my breath caught in my throat. He looked older, changed by time and silence, but there was a flicker of recognition and something deeper relief, fear, and a guarded hope. Our reunion wasn't filled with tears or dramatic embraces, but a quiet understanding, the kind that comes from shared pain and the weight of years spent apart. We spoke softly about the past and the secrets that had kept us apart, about what had happened and what we still didn't know. I realized that this was only the beginning, a fragile first step toward reclaiming what was lost and rebuilding a future no longer haunted by silence. It was a reunion not just with my brother, but with the truth that had been waiting for us all along, hidden in plain sight, just beyond the torn edges of a faded photograph. Reconstructing that torn photograph felt like piecing together the final puzzle of a lifetime I hadn't known I was solving until that moment. Each fragment, worn and brittle with age, held secrets, and when I carefully aligned the edges, the image began to reveal itself in a way that shook me to my core. It wasn't just a faded snapshot of a moment in time anymore. It was a map, a message, a silent testimony whispered through the paper's creases and the faces caught within the frame. At first, I saw familiar faces, friends and family smiling like a time capsule frozen in joy, but then my eyes caught something unsettling. In the background, just beyond the edges of what I had known, was a place I recognized only from hushed conversations and guarded memories. A forgotten cabin on the outskirts of town, one that had been off limits and wrapped in silence for decades. And there, standing just inside the doorway of that cabin, partially hidden in shadows, was a man no one in my family had ever spoken of. Someone whose presence explained the disappearances that had torn through our lives like a silent storm. I stared at the photo long after my fingers trembled and my breath caught, realizing that this torn piece was more than a broken picture. It was the key to unmasking the truth that had been buried beneath layers of fear and secrecy. The image captured a fleeting moment, Daniel's last known smile mingling with the shadow of that stranger, and the cabin that held stories no one dared to tell aloud. Suddenly, everything fell into place. The strange visits no one could explain, the whispered warnings, the veiled glances my parents exchanged whenever his name came close. That man, that cabin, was the hidden thread weaving through years of silence and pain, the place where Daniel's fate had been sealed far from the eyes of those who loved him. I could almost hear the echoes of his footsteps, fading into the woods, the hushed voices behind locked doors, the quiet that swallowed our questions whole. With the photo fully restored, the vague became clear, the unknown transformed into a path that I could follow. This torn photograph was no longer a fragment of loss, but a beacon guiding me through the darkness toward answers I had chased for too long. As I sat there with the completed image in my hands, the weight of years lifted slightly, replaced by a fierce determination to walk the path it illuminated. I knew that confronting this truth would change everything. It would bring pain and healing, anger and relief. But most importantly, it would finally bring Daniel home in the way he deserved. Not just in memory, but in truth. The days after the truth came out felt strangely quiet, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. I found myself drawn back to the family album more than ever, running my fingers over the worn pages that held not just memories, but now the story of our survival. It was no longer just a reminder of what we had lost, but a testament to what we had endured, a collection of moments that proved we could face the darkness and still find light. The faces in those photos, my brothers included, were no longer trapped in shadows of mystery. They were pieces of a puzzle finally coming together, each one a step toward healing. I began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about making peace with the past, letting the grief live alongside hope, and choosing to move forward despite it all. Our family slowly began to speak more openly, sharing stories and tears, creating new memories that were not overshadowed by silence. I started to rebuild my life with a clarity that had been impossible before, knowing that the search for answers, though painful, had freed me from the weight of uncertainty. The album stayed on my coffee table, no longer hidden away, but a proud symbol of resilience and truth, reminding me every day that even the deepest wounds could eventually lead to strength. And as I closed it each evening, I felt a quiet sense of peace, a readiness to face whatever came next, carrying my brother's story with me, not as a burden, but as a light guiding the way.